Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan and welcome to the year 2024. We've made it. There's a scene in A New Hope between Darth Vader and Admiral Modi. It's your typical Imperial / Sith / frat boy dick swinging pissing contest. Admiral Modi is extolling the virtues of the new battle station that he now gets to work on.
This station is now the ultimate power in the universe.
And Darth Vader, as usual, is trying to justify the terrible decisions he made at the end of the Clone Wars, which left him limbless and with third-degree burns all over his body, and no friends, no wife, twins who don't know they're twins, and so they end up hooking up with each other because he's an absent father.
Don't be too proud of this technological terror you've constructed. The ability to destroy a planet is insignificant next to the power of the Force.
Yeah, he went through all of that just for the dark side of the Force. You almost start feeling bad for him until you start remembering those lumpy little younglings he was supposed to protect. But the truth is, Admiral Modi and Darth Vader, well, they're both wrong. The Force is a mysterious and powerful tool, that is for sure, but even the most powerful beings that wielded the Force, the Celestials, couldn't stand up against the might of the Rakatan Infinite Empire. Those crazy sons of bitches tried to kill the gods, and so the Force gods had to flee, and they actually created the unknown region in order to hide. The Force is amazing and can do wonderful things. Heck, the Jedi can even transcend life and go to the aftermath, but still, they were no match for the might of the Galactic Empire and the clone army. The Force has its limits, and I think Palpatine and his predecessor Darth Plagueis and his predecessor Darth Tenebris realized this. They couldn't use the Force alone to defeat the Jedi. And looking back at ancient Old Republic history, the reason why the Old Republic and the Jedi always defeated the Sith Empire was ultimately not because of their Force abilities or their strategies on the battlefield, but the massive economic engine that the Republic built, expanded, and nurtured for tens of thousands of years. And so even though the Republic was always very late to react to, any kind of threat that was attacking them, even though they were always really late at producing a military force that could stand up against that threat, in the long run, the Republic always won. Once the gears started grinding, the Republic was unstoppable. At the end of the day, I don't care how fancy your lightsaber is, how amazing your Force lightning and battle meditation is. I don't care if you're a Force god, because nothing stands up against the might of the galactic economy, which is intertwined with every being in the galaxy. Kind of like the Force, but just better and more predictable. Well, sometimes more predictable. Now, speaking of lightsabers, a quick word from our sponsor for today's video, ownasaber.com. They made this baby, and they got an amazing New Year's deal for you guys. If you buy any of ownasaber.com's replica category sabers, like the Black Moon I was holding, you can get a free Padawan saber of your choice. I do recommend you guys take the time to look at ownasaber.com's wide selection of lightsabers. They have amazing designs from all your favorite characters, and the weight and build quality of these metal hilts are fantastic. If this deal sounds like something you're interested in, simply add both the replica and Padawan saber you want at checkout, and the discount will be applied automatically. Also, take a look at ownasaber.com's New Year's bundle, along with all of their newest sabers. Thank you for your patience. On to the rest of the video. So when the Sith realized that economics were key to controlling the galaxy, they started shying away from direct confrontation. Instead, they started acquiring assets, and with those assets, they gained political favor and influence. Within a few generations, the Sith had created a vast network of lobbyists, political organizations, corporations, and academic institutions that were all basically working for them. And with these newfound toys, they sought to undermine the institutions of the Republic from the shadows, preparing it for their takeover. The Sith would create shortages in crucial commodities, they would inflame sectarian violence, they would pit lender versus creditor, and just create chaos. The idea was create enough economic crisis and instability that the Republic would go running into their arms looking for a solution. And that's exactly what happens with the beginning of the Separatist crisis. The galaxy, desperate for a leader to get them through these tough times, gives Palpatine the power that he's always desired. Now, the funny thing is, when Darth Sidious finally succeeds in creating his empire and took out the Jedi Order, he seemed to have forgotten the very economic system he manipulated and used to gain control of the galaxy was the very thing that would also help keep him in power. Even the most powerful and authoritarian leaders still are beholden to the will of the people somewhat. And those people want a stable economic situation where their hard work can allow them to continue to improve their lives and grow. Slow down that economic engine and people's lives begin to change for the worse, opening them up to dissent and eventually rebellion. Now, Palpatine's approach to the galactic economy was kind of a dumb one. Instead of, reforming the bureaucratic structure to make doing business easier or investing in infrastructure, Palpatine focused on a military-first policy. And it was extravagant. Instead of refitting the Grand Army of the Republic, he scrapped most of the Navy, retired the clones, and started fresh with new designs and a new military structure. This kind of spending was only possible because Palpatine had seized control of the banks at the end of the Clone Wars. By doing so, he established a Federal Reserve of sorts, and this reserve was not politically independent, but sat directly in the pockets of Palpatine, which in the short term allowed him to print tons of credits and build one of the largest and expensive navies the galaxy's ever seen. In the long run, he was setting up the galaxy for a terrible economic collapse. The huge influx of cash to the military-industrial complex did initially create a lot of economic opportunities and jobs, but most economists believe that diverting money to military spending instead of civilian infrastructure leads to less growth, and in the long run could even come back to undermine military spending. An example of this would be North Korea's Songun military-first policy, which gives the Korean People's Army first dibs on the allocation of resources. At one point, North Korea was richer than South Korea, but after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and more importantly, the continued focus on their military-first policy, North Korea now has a nominal GDP that is 57 times less than South Korea. That's really poor. To make matters worse, in 2022, it was reported that North Korea spent over 33% of its GDP on its military, up from 26% in 2019. And of course, North Korea is on a downward spiral. They're gonna continue to spend more money on really just antiquated military equipment, and they will probably have to spend more, and they'll never really catch up to the South unless there's some kind of massive reform in both the political and economic structure of that country. And even then, they're already so behind that it would really be a miracle for them to ever catch up. But Palpatine's biggest mistake wasn't just his military-first policy, but how much of the galaxy's resources he concentrated into one single project, the Death Star. This was an immense project, and it took decades to plan, to design, and then eventually build. And it would consume entire planets of resources. With a width of 160 kilometers, 357 internal levels, and a surface area of over 45,000 kilometers. It was larger than some moons in the galaxy and had a larger population than some planets. And it was packed with a state-of-the-art reactor, a massive super laser, priceless kyber crystals, and tons of other proprietary military hardware. There's no real estimated price of how much the Death Star cost, and that's because from the very beginning, a lot of the details about this project were kept a secret, especially when Palpatine was still the Chancellor of the Republic. Like all things, during the Clone Wars, Palpatine had to create a reason why the Republic would need a weapon like this, and he did this by leaking some information that the Separatists were planning to build a super laser weapon. Palpatine would present a plan for the Republic's own super weapon, which actually was created by the Geonosians, and this project would be given to the Republic's Strategic Advisory Cell. The initial investment for the superstructure of the Death Star actually came from a variety of corporate interests that ties to the Sith, but also to the Separatists and the Republic. It's kind of confusing, but yeah, you had the Techno Union, the Trade Federation, the Munalist banking clans. They're the ones who provided that initial funding. And these are companies that Palpatine would conveniently destroy and nationalize after the Clone Wars ended. Instead of paying back these corporate entities, Palpatine essentially just killed everyone, which is, classic Sith move. Then you have the nationalization and theft of natural resources, industry, and manpower from all over the galaxy, which further cheapened the cost to build the Death Star. Most of the labor was either in the form of Geonosian hive mind drones, Imperial prisoners, alien slaves, and droids. Basically, this was free or very low-cost labor that the Empire could discard should there be any problems, like when the Geonosian hives rebelled against the Empire and destroyed like 3 months of work on the Death Star. Palpatine would actually just wipe out their entire species as a result. Now, even though the Empire nationalized a lot of resources and also made some shortcuts when it came to hiring labor, the Empire still had to borrow money in order to fund this project. And they would borrow money from all types of banking institutions, big and small. They would borrow from public and private funds and even individual investors. And so overnight, an entire economy was created, and it was solely based on providing interest payments for the Death Star. We're talking about a good chunk of the entire galaxy's GDP. We're talking about trillions upon trillions of credits, all dependent on the viability of this weapons platform and the continued payment for these debts by the Imperial military, which is really stupid because, the Death Star doesn't really provide any value or worth. It doesn't create anything. It just destroys planets. But then the Death Star would just vanish in one of the most shocking upsets in galactic history during the Battle of Yavin. Now, Imperial supporters often point out that the destruction of the Death Star did a massive amount of damage to the Empire's aura of invincibility. It actually inspired people who weren't sure whether the Empire could be defeated at all. The rebel victory made fighting against the Empire suddenly seem not that's suicidal. At the same time, it's well documented that the Death Star was staffed by some of the best personnel in the Imperial Navy. The sheer amount of experience and talent lost in that explosion was mind-boggling. But by far the biggest problem that the Death Star's destruction created was all of that debt that still was unpaid to all of those individual investors and institutions. Remember, an entire economy was created around this, and it just collapses overnight. And with the Death Star gone and Emperor Palpatine looking to build a second Death Star, the prospect of getting paid back was looking increasingly unlikely. Now, a normal political leader would go into crisis mode. Maybe they would print more credits or restructure the debt somehow and just make things work, keep the economy going. But Sith politics is chaotic and, kind of stupid at its core. It does not take into account how the economic system works. Plus, Palpatine loved seeing people struggle and fall apart, which, again, is a really dumb policy to have when you are in charge. This is also why the Sith oftentimes orchestrate their own ends, just through sheer neglect of what their duties are as a leader. As a result, a lot of these lenders, a lot of these institutions would completely collapse, and that would, of course, create a cascade of problems that would affect local job markets, local saving accounts, all these other kind of things. The disappearance of so much money overnight might have even cost a recession. Now, an economy that is more dynamic, that has the ability to quickly shift its resources around to different sectors, would be able to adjust better to this type of crisis. But the Imperial government really did not like to have a dynamic. But the centrally controlled nature of the Imperial government and the massive role the military and military-industrial complex had to play in almost every sector, region, and planet meant that the opposite happened. Already fragile local economies completely collapsed, leading to more desperation, food shortages, and political dissent, which of course was a ripe breeding ground for rebellion. And once the economic forces turned against the Empire, it was only a matter of time before Palpatine ran out of options. And so I guess the lesson we can learn today is that mega structures, mega projects like the Death Star are generally not a good idea. Unless you're, trying to save your planet from some crazy threat. There's never a good reason to concentrate so much resources in just one project. And generally in a free society with a functioning market, such projects are never taken on because of the high risk involved and the lack of demand. Take a look at all the super skyscrapers that have been popping up around the world in the last 20 years. These are the ultimate vanity power. And, one could argue that it's not very smart to build these things because there are very few places in the world, very few cities in the world that could sustain them. Buildings like Taipei 101 and the Freedom Tower have around 95% occupancy right now, which is quite good, but historically have really struggled to fill up their massive floor space, especially during the pandemic. But in less developed economies where these towers were designed to attract business instead of serve the business needs that already exist, the existing occupancy rates are even lower. The Petronas Towers in Kuala Lumpur has an occupancy rate lower than 70%. The Burj Khalifa is also around 30% empty. And even the Shanghai Towers hovers around an occupancy rate of 70% to 80%. And this is a building that is located in one of the most populous and richest cities in the world. It's very much the economic center of China. Mega projects like this are usually the result of a crazy concentration of wealth in one place and oftentimes a concentration of political power, especially when you move from just one super skyscraper to an entire city. I'm reminded of my trips to Dubai. A wondrous city, but unfortunately completely soulless and extremely poorly designed. Yes, I'll visit there every now and then to have some fun, but probably will never live in a place like that. The entire city was built in a span of a decade or so. It was very rushed and poorly planned. And the design was created by wealthy sheiks who don't really understand anything about city planning and a bunch of real estate developers who are more concerned at providing access to their large buildings than creating a coherent city. As a result, this city is almost impossible to walk around. It has very limited public transportation options, and the road layout just really doesn't make any sense. Also, around a decade ago, a lot of the city was disconnected to the sewer system, which meant that you saw poop trucks driving everywhere and mixing in with the morning congestion. I mean, even Burj Khalifa, the crown jewel, suffered from this constipation at one point. And this is why Dubai historically has a very low occupancy rate in all of its buildings. Also, there's a lot of illegal money that's planted there from criminals all around the world. And on a personal side note, the developers of these buildings could have at least added some Arabic flair to the buildings instead of just relying on the usual drab modern aesthetics that adorn so many major cities across the world. But still, Dubai looks like a functional and efficient paradise when you compare it to the plan that Saudi Arabia is trying to put together, known as the Line. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman wants to build a single glass building that will be 110 miles long and encompass a massive city within it. will have a population of 9 million people. Now, this is a beautiful and inspirational project, especially if you're watching all the glossy production videos. And if you also ignore the fact that 70% of real estate development projects from 2006 to 2016 in Saudi Arabia failed, mainly due to a lack of technical skill, poor planning, and of course, a lot of corruption, which itself is the result of an extremely chaotic society that is based on feudal fealty, as in your loyalty is not to the state but to the various tribes and clans that exist in the region. And there's also a political patronage system that more or less makes it impossible for people of merit and skill to rise up in ranks. Even at the bureaucratic level in Saudi Arabia, you constantly see tribal and familial fights. It's just not a proper functioning country. And we haven't even got to the religious and cultural reforms that will be necessary to truly untap the potential of the Saudi workforce. Right now, only a quarter of the female population participates in the workforce. And 66% of Saudis that are employed actually just work for the government, and the majority of the people who work in the private sector are foreigners. This is really not a good sign. Now, the truth is, such mega projects like the line, like the Death Star, are just a distraction, usually a desperate cry for help by political leaders who have no idea what to do or how to solve the biggest problems they're facing. Palpatine, when faced with the challenge of pacifying the galaxy and the Outer Rim, decided to blow up planets rather than strengthen the galactic economy and bring stability to the Outer Rim, something that could have provided a lot of economic growth for decades to come. And Saudi Arabia, which depends on oil for 75% of its fiscal revenue, is also facing a massive challenge to adapt to a future where fossil fuels will no longer be as important of a commodity. Instead of trying to diversify their economy or modernize their society and culture, which honestly is an incredibly difficult thing to do. I don't want to be in MBS's shoes, but still doesn't mean we can't criticize MBS for trying to build what essentially is a Death Star in the middle of the desert. So remember, guys, when you see these grand infrastructure plans, usually created by dictators, don't look at them and like, oh, I want these things in my country. Why is it that in America we can't afford to do these things? You really don't want these type of projects. You want small, incremental reform. You want small little things like, I don't know, bringing services to the poor, allowing women to have equal rights. Not as sexy, but these are things that have proven to work time and time again. All right, I guess that's all I have to say today. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that notification button down below. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. See you next time.